Hi, I'm Dana Shoaf, editor of Civil War Times Magazine, and I'm back with Melissa Winn, director of photography behind the camera. And now we are about 8 miles east of Antietam battlefield in the small town of Burkittsville, Maryland. And usually I don't like to wear sunglasses when I'm doing these things, but the sun is right in my face and it's reflecting off a metal roof on the other side of the street. So I'm going to put these on, if you'll forgive me for this one at least. So we've been at Antietam earlier today, if you saw our earlier Facebook Live events, but today we're on the east side of South Mountain. And if Melissa slowly pans to her left, you can see South Mountain, just a little bit of it popping up above those buildings. On September 14th, 1862, before the Battle of Antietam, there was fighting at 3 mountain gaps on South Mountain. From north to south, they were Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and then right above Burkittsville, right here, is Crampton's Gap. And that's where Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia Rear Guard was fighting the advanced units of Major General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. Now, after that fighting, of course, there were wounded men. And the wounded men were brought off the mountain, and again, I apologize for the traffic noise through here, but those wounded men were brought off the mountain into small towns like Burkittsville. And many of the churches in this town were converted into hospitals. Right behind me is an 1829 building, built in 1829, the German Reformed Church. And unfortunately, for the parishioners of the church and for the townsfolk of Burkittsville, in 1860, that church had been remodeled. It had all new carpet put in, all new pews, all new appointments. But on September 14th, it became a hospital. It was known as Hospital D. Eyewitnesses in the town recalled that the pews were torn out of the church, thrown into the front yard, and that they were broken and splintered. A woman remembered going in and seeing a pile of amputated limbs just inside the door. Straw was laid down on the new Brussels carpet, and wounded men were laid down on that straw, their blood seeping through the straw and ruining the carpet. Other eyewitnesses talk about the blood smeared all over the wall of the church. So you can imagine this small town of 200 people at the time, a small, fairly sleepy agricultural town, and suddenly it's full of wounded men in all the churches. Now, the wounded men were actually in this facility until January of 1863. They were in a long time before they were finally moved out to larger hospitals in Frederick, Maryland. Some Union men died here, and also Confederate soldiers were brought off the mountain who also died in and around the hospital. They were temporarily buried in the Union Cemetery that you can see just the gate of it behind the church. The Union Cemetery doesn't have anything to do with the Civil War. It was maintained by a union of 2 churches. Eventually, those men, the Union men, will be reinterred in the Antietam National Battlefield Cemetery, which we were at earlier, and the Confederates will be exhumed and moved to the Confederate Cemetery in Hagerstown, Maryland. Now, one of those Confederate casualties was a man named Sergeant Benjamin Mell of Cobb's Georgia Legion. And when the Confederate casualties were brought down here, they didn't get in the buildings. This was Union controlled, and the Union wounded got the priority to go inside the structures. The Confederate casualties were laid outside. Sergeant Mell was laying somewhere outside the hospital when a local citizen came by and saw him and took measures to try to help and save Sergeant Mell's life. In our final stop of the day, we're going to talk about Sergeant Mell and finish his story. Before we leave, I wanted to show you a couple things about the church itself. This is really well maintained by the South Mountain Heritage Society. They use it as their headquarters, and it's open the first Saturday of every month in the afternoon. And they have a website, you can check it out. I think it's open from 10 to 3 the first Saturday of every month. So you can come and get in this church if you want to and see more of the history of it inside. We're going to walk up a little bit closer to the church now. And as we do, this is a Greek Revival style building. This style of architecture, I like architecture as well, began to become very popular in the 1820s through the 1830s as Americans looked to classical Greek and Rome for examples of